Good afternoon, everyone. We are starting part A of the session, SDGs and Inequality, which comprises a very interesting set of papers and presentations. Thank you all for joining. It's really a pleasure for me to moderate this session. Thank you for the invitation. There will be 5 presentations, 4 of them focusing on the Latin American and Caribbean region, and the other one on the United States. 3 of the papers were developed within the framework of a United Nations Development Account project called Demographic Transition, Opportunities and Challenges to Achieve the SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean, that has been recently implemented in the region by ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. As you will have the opportunity to enjoy, all papers show the pertinence of NTAs for analyzing not only intergenerational inequality, but also socioeconomic inequality within generations. In a variety of ways, they all highlight the inadequacy of analyzing averages in contexts of high inequality. So let me briefly explain how the session is organized. First, panelists will have 10 minutes maximum for each presentation. Then each discussant, there are 2 discussants for this session, will have 5 to 7 minutes for their interventions. And finally, there will be, I hope, some time, 15 to 20 minutes, for an open discussion. So now, I would like to introduce for the first presentation, Ms. Nicole Lai and Tim Miller, Mr. Tim Miller. They are both from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DISA, and they will give us the presentation on NTAs for the 90s. Nicole and Tim, I understand that we'll do a joint presentation. You have the floor.
Yes, okay. So you're seeing a big picture of a plane, correct? Here we are in our final approach to Honolulu Airport, virtual Hawaii. So we're sorry we can't be there in person, but we're looking forward to that next year. So we're going to talk about NTAs for the 90%. And this is shorthand for looking at the economic life cycle of the non-rich. Okay, so what can NTAs tell us about the economic life of the non-rich? That is 90% of the population. We're defining the non-rich as the bottom 90% of the pre-tax income distribution. Okay, so the first point we want to make, this big caution sign here, is that averages are likely to mislead us. This is the point that Paulo just made in his introduction. So in the case of NTAs, NTAs are based on averages by age. They may not reflect the economic experience of the vast majority of people in the country. Why? Well, because consumption, labor earnings, assets, taxes, they're all highly skewed distributions. So the richest 10% consume more, they earn much more, they own much more than the general population. So NTA averages are going to be heavily influenced by these outliers. And so if we're looking to tell a story about what's happening to most of the people in a national population, in some sense, the rich are kind of obstructing our view. And so the idea of the NTAs for the 90% is to remove this richest 10% from the analysis so we can look and see what's happening to the 90%. Okay, so there are 2 methods for doing that. Method 1 on the left and method 2 on the right. So method 1 is the one Nicole and I are presenting today, NTAs for the 90%. This is best viewed as kind of an initial benchmark. It's a simple hack of the NTAs. And so like all hacks, has the advantage of being relatively simple and quick. And of course has the disadvantage of perhaps problems with accuracy. So what this method does is it combines two data sources, national transfer accounts and distributional national accounts. We'll talk about those in a minute. And so the idea of this method is to give us information on the 90%, kind of as a monolithic whole, what's happening amongst the 90%. Now, of course, within the distribution, there's lots of interesting things we want to look at there. But in this method, we're just looking at that population as a group. Now, the second method, distributional NTAs, well, that's the gold standard, right? That's a very sophisticated imputation. It creates NTA micro data sets, and it gives us information on everyone. So the preferred method 2, that's the gold standard. It takes a long time to do. It's very data intensive. Method 1 is a simple hack. It gives us an initial benchmark. Okay, so here's the representation of the simple hack. We're just adding information from these two data sources. So DINA plus NTA equals the NTA for the 90%. So in step 1, we're estimating the NTA macro control totals for the non-rich population using data from distributional national accounts. And this, we're specifically looking at Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman from 2018. And, a lot of props to Professor Zuckman for putting all this data, microdata, online. So, and very well documented. So it was quite easy to go in there and get a hold of these micro data files. So we get the NTA control totals for the non-rich population by removing the rich, and so using the distributional national account data. And then in step 2, we take the NTA age profiles that we already have, the average NTA age profiles we already have, and we just adjust the level of each of those profiles. Okay, I'm halfway through the slides and I'm at 5-minute mark, so we're good. Okay, so here's what the NTA macro control totals look like, the shares for the rich and the non-rich. Again, using these two data sources, the distributional national accounts and then the NTA macro control totals. So in consumption, you see that the rich account for 26% of consumption, 41%, surprising 41% of labor income. A lot of the labor income of the rich is self-employed income. Over on the right, private asset income, you see that the richest 10% richest 10% own 57%, more than half of private asset income. And of course, then they're paying more than half, 54% of taxes. And again, that high tax share is mainly a reflection of the fact that they just have so much money. It's not so much a reflection of the progressivity of the tax system itself. Okay, so that's step 1. We get the NTA macro controls. So we then are just adjusting each of these age profiles upward, each individual age profile upward. So private consumption, public consumption, self-employed labor earnings, et cetera, each individual component. And on the left-hand side, we see the typical NTA result. This is taken again from the NTAs for the US for 2011. And here we see the story we would tell based on this figure, looking at how older persons fund their consumption. We would say that in the US, older persons mainly rely on assets to support their consumption in old age, because you see that 50% of their consumption needs are met through private assets. Okay, so now we're going to look at, we're going to look at the result for the 90% of the population. So we remove the richest 10% and we see what's happening to the remaining 90. Okay, so the remaining 90 non-rich. I guess I'm just building excitement here by clicking through this. Okay, there we go. So the result for the non-rich is the opposite. So it turns the story around in the opposite direction. Here we see that the majority of the US population, the non-rich, rely mainly on public transfers. So we go from a situation where we were saying that the elderly mainly rely on private assets to one where we see they mainly rely on public transfers. Okay, so I'm down to my last minute. Time has flown by. Okay, but now we're on to the next steps. Okay, so what are the next steps in our project? Well, the most obvious next step, before we get too far deep into the analysis, which I think is really fascinating because we got all of the NTA age profiles, so we can look at the complete picture of what's happening to the economic life cycle of the non-rich. Well, first we want to make sure this hack is working well. So we'd like to evaluate this against a gold standard, and that's going to be distributional NTAs. And we're going to hear more about distributional NTAs later in the week. And in fact, Ron, Gretchen, Andy, and Michael are going to be presenting something on the US. So we'll be taking a careful look at that. If this hack works, then great, because we can estimate NTAs for the 90% of all NTA countries using information gleaned from distributional national accounts and the World Inequality Database, which has information for many of our NTA countries. And then finally, both distributional NTAs and distributional national accounts have the same target. They're both aiming to develop a micro accounting of the macro economy. So both research groups are confronting the same sorts of problems. How do we assign taxes? How do we assign public benefits? What about the debt, the deficits? How do we assign those to individuals? Well, the two research groups have arrived at different conclusions, different solutions for these, or different hypotheses. And so it'd be interesting to encourage dialogue between the two groups. And I'll stop share there with 5 seconds left.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for your presentation. I think it's indeed a very interesting methodological approach to deal with the issue of how inequality can bias NTA's results that are based on simple averages. And thank you for being on time also. Let me introduce now Mr. Cássio Turra and Ms. Fernando Fernandes. They are both from CEDEPLAR, the Center for Development and Regional Planning of the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. They are going to present the paper on demographic transition, opportunities and challenges to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in Latin America and the Caribbean. I understand that's going to be a pre-recorded video that you are going to present. So, Cássio and Fernando, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Thank you, everyone, for inviting us for this presentation. Thank you, Tim Miller, for saving time for me. Good night. I'm Cássio Turra, and in collaboration with Fernando Fernandes and Paulo Saad, I will talk about the demographic transition and its opportunities and challenges to achieving the SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean. This presentation is based on a study elaborated within the framework for the Development Account project implemented by CELAD in Chile. As we all know, the Latin America and Caribbean region has witnessed rapid demographic, socio-economic, and political transformations in the last 50 years. However, despite reductions in poverty and improvements in education, health, and gender equity, many problems remain. Inequality, yes, always inequality, both within and between generations, is still at unacceptable levels. We know that in 2015, the United Nations approved the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This agenda sets out a global framework for ending extreme poverty and fighting inequality and injustice. However, the agenda is susceptible to both demographic change and the way families, governments, and the market distribute resources and time within and between age groups. So it seems to us, when we started this document, we discussed that the SDG period requires forward-looking policies that take population dynamics and the generation economy into account. I guess we here in this seminar all agree that the national transfer accounts, the NTAs, provides the kind of comparable data needed for evidence-based approach to this challenge. So in this study, we tried to address these issues. Our main goal was to relate the demographic changes with the NTA and SDG measures in the region. To do this, we work in 4 different sections by adding up the different dimensions. We first characterize the demographic transition through change in the population age structure. We then categorize the allocation of resources over the life cycle with a special focus on children and the elderly. In both analyses, we clustered the countries and measured associations between demographic measures and NTA measures. Next, we select SDG indicators, particularly those that are most likely to be interrelated with both the demographic change and the NTA measures. We then explore potential associations among all these 3 dimensions. At the end, we discuss challenges and provide recommendations. I should warn everyone who's listening to this presentation that this is just an exploratory description of the potential associations between the 3 dimensions: the demographic, generational, and development. It's not intended to model and test any causal relations. So, starting with our first section of dimension, we examined the age transition in the world. For that, we used data from the population division for 201 different countries from 1950 to 2100. There are many ways to measure change in the population structure. We chose to estimate the children age dependence ratio and the old age dependence ratio as a way to allow us to build more easily associations between the demographics and the NTA dimensions. We can calculate the CADR and the old age measures for each year in country, but also we measure weighted measures for different periods using years as the weights. After doing that, we categorize the different stages of the demographic transition using different methods. In our document, we present several analyses comparing the age transition across time and regions of the world and examining its association with other demographic variables. Since I do not have the time here, I will show you just a few things. First, overall, child and old age dependence ratio are negatively associated, as you can see in this figure. But the association is not linear. In the first stage, CADR can get as high as 150 children per 100 adults, and old ADR as low as 7.5. CADR then reduces to less than 30 per 100 adults, while OADR increased to about 65 elderly per 100 adults at the most advanced stages of the demographic transition. But this transformation takes time to happen, and it's not until CADR reaches levels around 50 per 100 for the old age dependence ratio to really increase. This is another way, of course, to show the first demographic dividend. Of course, the duration and intensity of change vary across countries. This process is not uniform. In Latin America, the demographic transition started at different times during the 19th and the 20th century. But the changes have been very fast in the region compared to other regions of the world. So as we can see in this figure, in the 1980-2020 period, the Latin American countries occupy intermediate positions or categories in the age transition process. But once we look into the future, We can see that the countries move fast to most advanced positions, particularly countries like Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, and Colombia will reach very advanced points in the age transition. This is important because population aging will take place faster in Latin America than it has in Europe, but at the lower levels of economic development and with high and persistent levels of inequality. Well, it's not only demographic changes that dictate the ability of countries to reach high levels of sustainable development. As we said, the structure of the generation economy, how societies decide to allocate resources from the most productive aids to the most vulnerable aids, is also critical. So in the second section, we examine the NTA measures. Many measures can be estimated from the NTA data. Our methodological choice were limited to the elements of the generation economy that could be connected to the demographic transition and the SDGs in a more comprehensible and coherent scheme. So the most obvious selection criteria was age. And for that, we measure both size and the composition of consumption at younger and older ages. We also measure intergenerational relations by associating net public and private transfers to children and the elderly. We cluster countries according to these different measures using a different series of methods. I will share with you again only a few results, and these are the results for the older ages. So as you can see in this figure, relate consumption size in the X with consumption composition in the YX for the NTA countries. What we get is a set of cluster of countries depending on the combination of these two dimensions. We can also think this relationship between size and composition of consumption at the older is in terms of 4 quadrants. For example, on the right side of the graph are countries with larger relative size of consumption at older age and where the public sector plays a more important role. On the lower left side, on the other hand, we get the opposite. Countries with relatively lower consumption flows at older age and reduced participation of the public sector. Latin American countries are most on the right side of the graph, showing patterns that are similar to the European countries. So now we have 2 dimensions, demographic and NTA. We can connect them by measuring the correlations between the categories of age transition and the NTA quadrants. Here you can see the example for the old age consumption. What are the main findings? Well, countries in the most advanced stages of the demographic transition are characterized by higher per capita consumption at the dependent age, both young and old, and higher public sector participation. On the other hand, there is no statistically significant correlation between intergenerational relations and the demographic transition. So countries with comparable age distributions, for example here, Asian and Latin American countries, may differ in the roles played by the families, the public sector, and the financial market in supporting older people. In other words, the composition of resources allocated to older people may be more strongly associated with political and historical context than with the demographic change. So, to what extent are demographic changes and strategies of resource allocation over the life cycle associated with measures of well-being? So, then it comes our third section or dimension, the SDGs. One of the contributions of our paper was to pre-select the SDG indicators that have the strongest potential to affect and be affected by demographic and NTA measures. For that, we obtained a list of targets and indicators established by the United Nations for every SDG. The priority was to include indicators measuring the well-being of children and older people, who were the focus of the demographic and NTA analysis. The final list kept 11 indicators with data for as many countries as possible to avoid selection bias. It did not include the gender-related indicators because of the lack of a complete set of intra-age NTA measures that could be used to correlate with them. So here is a list of the final 11 indicators. And for each indicator, SDG indicator on that list, we measure its prevalence across countries and its association with both the demographic and the NTA dimensions. This is the example for poverty rates at older ages. At the end, the exploratory analysis that we conducted in this study suggests that well-being indicators tend to improve at the most advanced stages of the demographic transition. There are different hypotheses regarding this finding. On the one hand, the reduction in the children dependence ratio during the demographic transition allows countries to invest in human capital and promote economic growth and well-being before population aging poses new challenges. On the other hand, lower poverty rates and better education and health accelerate the demographic transition. So demographic change and SDG indicators may also be connected through different dimensions not included in this analysis, the quality of institutions, gender equity, urbanization, and democracy. Concerning the NTA measures, improved SDG indicators are found for countries where consumption at younger and old age is greater relative to adults' labor income, and where the public sector plays a more important role in providing service to the two dependent age groups. Once more, the associations may work both ways, reinforcing the correlations. In addition, other dimensions not included in our analysis may explain the relationships found. For example, in a preliminary analysis, we found that the correlations between NTA and SDG indicators lost significance when demographic transition states were controlled before. Overall, intergenerational relations, the balance between resource transfer to children and older people through families and the public sector, did not seem to affect the SDG indicators. As mentioned, countries at similar development levels may opt for different channels for allocating resources by age, including asset-based reallocations, without worsening levels of well-being. So the analysis conducted in the paper has ignored several of the problems that countries in Latin America and the Caribbean have faced in seeking to secure development and well-being for all population subgroups. We did highlight some of these challenges. I guess I will not have the time to discuss in detail each one of them, but the first thing to mention is population aging. Population aging is in the future of the region, of the Latin American and the Caribbean region, and will certainly impose many challenges for the region to improve its SDG indicators, and particularly for subgroups of the population. We can also measure this population aging challenge in terms of increases in consumption related to labor income. As we can see in this table, I will not go into this in the detail. We can discuss that later. And maybe more important, inequality, as I said, is one of the most critical obstacles to sustainable growth in Latin America and the Caribbean. So here we have some NTA measures by population groups, and as we can see, there are big differences between men and women and high and low socioeconomic groups. These should be taken into account in future analysis. So to conclude, the analysis presented in our paper has suggested that as the demographic transition proceeds, NTA and SDG indicators shift toward higher consumption, great public provision of service to children and older people, and improved indicators of well-being, lower poverty rates, better education, and health. However, there is no guarantee that after becoming older, countries in the first stage of the demographic transition will also become wealthier, more developed, and less unequal. There are many methodological issues that hinder the study of the association of demographic transition, NTA, and SDGs. We use cross-sectional data, which precludes one from tracing the real trajectories of this relationship between these three dimensions. The NTA project that has made important contributions to the study of the associations between economic and demographic variables also needs to move faster beyond the inter-age relations to inter-age analysis, because as we saw in that slide, the research has shown very different patterns of generational economy for groups living in the same countries. Finally, regarding the SDG list of indicators, we should say that it is incomplete. There are no data by age and SES measures. There are some data by gender, but maybe it is not enough. Well, I guess I'll stop here since my time is up and let other points for the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cássio and Fernando, for the presentation. Your work represents a newly and very interesting methodological approach to connect the NTAs and the SDGs indicators, which I'm sure, I know, that had entailed a very great effort to do. It clearly shows the relevance of NTAs for the follow-up of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. So, congratulations for the work. Without losing time, I now introduce Ms. Marta Duda Nixak from CELADI, the population, my colleague from the Population Division of the United Nations ECLAC, who will present the study on demographic transition and achieving the SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean, a regional overview of the National Transfers Account. So Marta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Paulo. Hi, hello everyone. Let me share my screen. Perfect. Today's presentation will focus on presenting just a couple of highlights from the study we are currently working on, analyzing the impact of the demographic changes on achieving the SDGs in Latin America and the Caribbean. The purpose of the study is first actually to get a picture of a typical NTA profile in the region, which is simply done by calculating averages of the 10 countries for which the data was available. So definitely no rocket science there. Well, as Tim was saying in his presentation, averages can be misleading, but for our purposes, it still helps to get some approximation to look for the direction where we should go. Then the study analyzes impacts of the future demographic trends and related challenges in achieving the SDGs, particularly taking this new post-COVID reality into consideration. Finally, the paper looks at possible policy response oriented on best accommodating the anticipated changes. Maybe before I go to present the major results, just a few takeaways to keep in mind for further analysis in terms of the demographic and socioeconomic context of the region. As surely many of you know, and it was also mentioned by Cássio in his presentation, lax population age structure changes drastically with societies aging at a tremendous pace. At the same time, there are persistent inequalities, a lot of informality and precarious jobs in the labor market, and the economic performance was actually very volatile and weak even before the pandemic, hitting its record lows since the 1950s in the years preceding the current crisis. So now adding to this the devastating effect of the pandemic, with the expected contraction for the region of over 9% of GDP, ECLAC's estimates show that actually the region will set back on the progress towards many SDGs. For example, there will be a drop back in the GDP per capita, skyrocketing poverty levels, and even larger inequalities. So keeping all that in mind and passing to the results now, which will be presented as averages in relative terms, that is relative to the average of labor income between 30 and 49 years old. The first graph shows the regional average of the per capita life cycle deficit. And it can be observed that the consumption grows until early 20s, after which it oscillates around a similar level till 90 years old. And the income curve has got this typical inverse U shape. And when both are combined, it is clearly seen that countries in Latin America and the Caribbean on average have got a relatively short period of surplus, 26 years old on average, and that surplus magnitude is actually low comparing to the deficits generated in childhood and particularly older ages. And that limited capacity to cover deficits is even more visible on an aggregate level. It can be seen that there is a peak in consumption of youths and young adults, indicating still a relatively young age structure in the region. And the aggregate deficit of children and adolescents is also nearly 4 to 5 times higher than that of older persons cohort. At the same time, the magnitude of surplus generated is significantly smaller than the deficits to cover. As for the deficit financing mechanism, family remains the major source, be it in the form of private transfers or private asset-based reallocations. As seen in the graph on the left, both for children and youths as well as for older persons, family plays an important role in financing their deficits. However, public transfers are also a significant flow for the elderly. When public transfer inflows are analyzed in detail on the right-hand side, it is shown that pensions, marked in light blue, are a big part of per capita public transfers, and healthcare increases with age, all of which can obviously cause fiscal sustainability issues in the future. Furthermore, when combining the NTA average profiles with population projections, one easily observes the expected shift of aggregate consumption towards older age groups. In the graph on the left, illustrating year 2030, the peak mentioned before for youths and young adults is no longer so pronounced, and the consumption spreads more towards older cohorts, while the income curve remains quite similar. But due to aging, the life cycle the deficit actually decreases in relative terms for children, whereas it goes up for the elderly. And those changes are more blatant in the graph on the right, representing 2050. The consumption is spread quite evenly across all the working population, with a visible increase in the deficit of the older population, but only a slight drop in the deficit of children. Very quickly, when the support ratios relative to their 2020 level are taken into consideration, it is clear that due to aging, the region's capacity to satisfy the needs of the dependent population will be falling sharply. Seen on the left, on average, the economic support ratio will follow the favorable growing trend only for about a decade more. However, the fiscal support ratio that takes into account the effective number of taxpayers to the effective number of public transfers beneficiaries will start falling already from 2021 onwards, confirming that the current fiscal systems will be put at a serious risk due to the changing age structure in the region. Therefore, combining all that with the post-COVID harsh socioeconomic reality, or I should say for now still the COVID reality, it becomes evident that the anticipated demographic trends might be a particular challenge, much bigger than ever expected before. Firstly, even for those countries for which the age structure could favor the economic growth for a couple of decades, there might be actually very little chance to use that opportunity window due to higher unemployment rate, more informality in the labor market, or other structural difficulties thwarting the possibilities of using the working age population to the maximum. Secondly, it is obvious that need for social spending, in particular social protection, is on the increase in the region due to the pandemic, which will only further exacerbate the already fragile prospects of fiscal sustainability. Finally, we could also see that the decreased consumption in education does not compensate increases in the consumption of healthcare and pensions of older persons. So it is not necessarily a channel for some fiscal relief either. Hence, the need for a decided policy response is stronger than ever to assure that the region can even stand a chance of accommodating the upcoming trends. And as there might be little space to change the consumption patterns, achieving the effect of shifting the whole income curve up through boosting productivity of labor force, businesses, and the economy as a whole should be a medium and long-term goal for Latin American states. The possible measures include higher per capita spending on education or investments in infrastructure, know-how, technology, but also an effort should be put into incorporating the usually marginalized groups into the labor markets, such as women or youths. So just to quickly wrap it up, I want to emphasize a couple of points to take away from the presentation. It is obvious that the expected demographic dynamics in the region becomes a particular challenge for Latin American states in those difficult post-COVID times that will come, and it calls for an unprecedented effort. Maintaining the status quo of NTA profiles was not really a good option even pre-pandemic, but now it seems actually a definite no-go. So for that reason, the proactive policy response is a must for Latin America and the Caribbean to achieve sustainable development, and finding more productive and lasting patterns of income and wealth generation is the way to go suggested in the study. And obviously all that might not be possible in the short term due to other priorities related to mitigating the pandemic effects, but it should definitely enter the policy agendas in the longer run. And I think I'm up with my time, so thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you very much for presentation. It was very nice to have this regional overview of the NTAs in several countries of in Latin America, Caribbean. So I understand that the analysis was based in the most recent data from several countries of the region. It was taken from the results from the Development Account Project from NECLAC. And also, thank you for your timely warning on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that will certainly have on the sustainability of economic and the fiscal system, and something that we definitely cannot be disregarded in the future analysis. Thank you. I now turn the floor to Mr. Pablo Comelato from CENEP, Center for Population Studies of Argentina, who will present his study on the intergenerational and intersocioeconomic group transfers in Argentina, based on NTA estimates for the 2016. Go ahead, Pablo.
Okay, let me, okay, so I'm going to present NTA estimates for Argentina in 2016 by SES group, so socioeconomic status group. I want to show how transfers are simultaneously intergenerational, which of course we all know, but also inter-socioeconomic status group, and interact those results with the changing demography of the country, as well as the differential demography of the SES groups. For those of you who don't know much about Argentina, I'll just say it's an upper middle income country with a long history of macroeconomic instability, high levels of inflation and government indebtedness. Poverty usually fluctuates between 25 and 50% of the population, depending on the economic situation. Can go depending on on inflation and recurrent crisis. Poverty can go up or down relatively fast. Also, labor informality fluctuates between 35 and 45% of the labor force. Meaning that among other things, we have a significant number of individuals in labor force that don't contribute regularly to social security and are also not protected by labor regulations. As a result of all of this, but also as a cause, the country has experienced very low growth, GDP growth for most of the second half of the 20th century, and is now close to complete a whole decade with zero economic growth. And this was even before the pandemic, so the situation now is even worse than this. Okay, on the other hand, talking about the demography, Argentina was an early example of demographic transition in the context of Latin America, beginning the decline of mortality and fertility in the late 19th, early 20th century. So as a consequence of these low fertility rates, population growth rate has also been relatively low for most of the 20th century. And consequently, Argentina's population began to age early in the 20th century. So here I just show the proportion of population 65 and over from 1950 to 2100. So you see right now we are around 11%, but you see the increase in the proportion began 1950 or actually earlier than that. But also let me mention, and this is going to be important in a couple of minutes, a temporary increase in fertility in the 1970s and 1980s. So there's a relatively large birth cohort from those years that, well, obviously are going to be important to understand the age structure today. So the introduction of low population growth for most of the 20th century and this temporary increase in fertility. I'm going to summarize all of these trends, presenting the economic support ratio of the population, using NTA, labor earnings and consumption profile, which I'm not going to show you those profiles here because I want to focus on socioeconomic groups, but using those profiles, well, we see the trend in the support ratio, declining since 1950 until more or less the mid 1990s, and around that time, well, it's when the support ratio begins to increase, which is around the time when this large birth cohort that I mentioned, well, they begin to reach labor ages. So you see here in pink this like a window opportunity with the support ratio increasing. This, of course, is we know this as the demographic dividend. Well, now we are in the red line. So we are past half the length of this window. So we are approaching to well, next decade is going to be the end of this demographic window. So we should take advantage of the demographic dividend right now. We should be doing it right now. And as I'm going to show you, the country is not in a good position to take advantage of the demographic dividend. So to study this, I divided the population in 3 socioeconomic status groups based on the education level of the head of the household. They are roughly 1/3 of the population, with some small differences, but as you would expect, the highest SES group, this is number 3 here. So this group presents better performance in terms of labor market participation, unemployment, proportion of workers employed in the formal sector, higher earnings, and there's no surprise there. But what I want to highlight now is the differential age structure of the 3 groups, which is, I think it's a new finding from this work. Here I present the blue bars represent the age structure of each group as compared to the age structure of the 2 other groups, respectively, in gray bars. So if we focus, let's begin with the first group, with the lowest SES, it shows an aged population with an excess of older adults and a deficit of children and middle-aged adults. So we can say it's an age group with relatively low level, well, actually absolutely low levels of education. Group 2 approximates the classic population pyramid. So this is when both sex combines. So this is not actually a pyramid, but the combining both sexes. Well, more or less approximates what we expect for a relatively young population, with a deficit of older adults. So what you see here is this, the gray profile here represents the adults that are missing in this group. And finally, group 3 is peculiar because it has a deficit of both children and older adults, and is prominent the presence of the large 1970s birth cohort, which are represented here with the deep blue bars. So you see how prominent that large cohort is in group 3, the group with the highest socioeconomic status. So as a way to summarize these differential age profiles, I show here, well, this is again the economic support ratio that we saw before, but I added here with these 3 dots going from bottom to top, the support ratio for the respective socioeconomic groups. So in blue here we have the group 1, the lowest socioeconomic group, and you see it has a very low support ratio, lower than any level that the total population has or will ever experience for the whole 100 years that we have here. On the other extreme, we have group 3, the gray dot here, and group 3 has the highest support ratio, again, higher than any level that the total population has or will ever experience. So when we say that Argentina is going through the demographic window of opportunity, well, it is essentially the highest SES group that is in fact doing so. And again, I think this is an interesting finding from this work. So these are the labor earnings and consumption profiles for the 3 groups. Not surprisingly, well, let me show you the life cycle deficit for the 3 groups. So not surprisingly, the group 3 shows the largest surplus, both in terms of how long and how deep the surplus is, while group 1 has almost no surplus at all, only about five years. So here is where public transfers become very relevant to understand the interaction between the SES groups. In this table, we can see how public transfers finance 47% and 17%. So we have here 47% and 17% of the aggregate life cycle deficit for groups 1 and 2, while group 3, with a negative here, is a net payer in terms of public transfers. So that is group 3 finances the transfers to the other groups. This is the same table, except that it shows the different public transfer programs. It's a long table, don't worry about all of the details. I just want to highlight the role of the pension system here in pink, we have the proportion of the life cycle deficit for each group, the proportion that is financed by the pension system. And as you can see, the pension system finances close or more than 100% of the old age life cycle deficit for all groups. And this is because Argentina's pension system is a relatively generous one. So not surprisingly for group 3, it's an important source of financing, but also for groups 2 and 1. And this has to do with recent reforms of the pension system, but recent, I mean the last decade or so, that extended coverage and made it almost universal, including former workers of the informal sector. On the other hand, for children, besides public education, cash transfers are also significant, particularly for the children in group 1. And this is because of the implementation in 2009 of a child allowance for children with unemployed parents or working in the informal sector. So you see, we have 2 transfer programs, pensions, and this child allowance that support consumption for dependents, children, and the elderly in groups 1 and 2. Okay, so conclusions. First, SES groups have very distinctive age profiles. And this is something that, well, I didn't know before starting this. So I think there's an interesting result of this analysis. Second, the demographic dividend is only relevant for group 3, which in a sense is good because this means relatively highly educated workers are part of the largest cohort. But on the other hand, dependents in the other groups, in the 1 and 2 groups, don't have a large working age population to support them, and hence demanding more support from public transfers. Group 3 faces a triple burden: finance human capital investment for their own children via private transfers, financed fixed capital formation, investment, which, as I said before, the country has well, a very poor growth performance. So investment is badly needed, and well, it's another demand for the group 3. And finally, finance public transfers to the dependents in the other groups. So, and I finish with this. The country is not in a good position to benefit from the demographic dividend, and socioeconomic heterogeneity has a lot to do with this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, for your presentation. That I think highlights the complexity of the interaction between a large public sector with financing difficulties, an aging population, and a social structure with significant levels of inequality. Very important, the question that you raise in your paper on whether the size of the public sector contributes to macroeconomic stability, as posed by many, or in fact it reflects or even is fundamental to address the distortions generated by socioeconomic inequality. I think this is a very interesting debate, and particularly important in our region, that many see as a strong state government is very important to address the inequality. Well, I would like to invite Cecilia Gonzalez and Marisa Buccelli. They are both from the Universidad de la República of Uruguay, to give us the last presentation of this session on investment in human capital by socioeconomic status in Uruguay. I understand that you record the presentation, so go ahead with the video.
Yes, thank you. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, everyone. The work that I am going to present is investment in education and health in children by socioeconomic status in Uruguay, and what was made with Marisa Bukele. Uruguay is a small country with only 3.3 million inhabitants. Its social protection, education, and health system had an early development in comparison to other Latin American countries. At present, it's part of the group of countries with the lowest levels of inequality in the region. Otherwise, the country has one of the oldest populations in Latin America, so a key aspect to achieve a future increase in productivity is to invest in education and health in childhood and youth. There is a major concern with the educational system because of the high rate of school dropout and repetition. Also, there are large differences by socioeconomic level. In the recent years, 73% among the richest quintile complete upper secondary and only 10% for the lowest. On the other hand, previous studies show that the average health outcomes of children are like the ones reported for developed countries. However, the study highlights that the performance is worse for poor children in terms of chronic malnutrition, obesity, fine motor, etc. In this study, we analyzed the result of NTA 2013 by SES focuses on children under the age of 21. To estimate NTA by socioeconomic status, we classified the population in 4 SES groups based on the education of the head of the household. Each SES group includes population living in households where the head has these ranges of education, less than 9 years of schooling, 9 to 11, 12 to 15, and 16 or more. To estimate population by SES, we use the proportion of SES groups in each age in the household SES for the same year. This table shows that the share of SES groups in the population decreased with SES. Let's start with a quick look of the overall result of labor income and consumption by SES. These are the per capita age profile as a percentage of the average labor income for ages 30 to 49. The average individual is the black dotted line. As expected, labor income and consumption increases with SES, and the gap is higher for the former. On average, consumption of children under 21 represent 54% of average labor income. Consequently, the life cycle deficit rises with SES at childhood and old ages, but surplus is more pronounced as SES increases at working ages. That suggests a pressure on the resources generated by the medium, high, and high groups. On average, the stage of surplus covers 32 years ages. The length of surplus is similar for all SES groups, but the age of entry and exit to the surplus stage increases with SES. We are interested in the first stage of the life cycle deficit, that is in childhood and youth. Previous work for Uruguay using NTA indicate that private transfers play a major role in the support of children and young. In this study, we interpret that for each child SES group, these private transfers come from the working age people of the same SES. Bearing this in mind, we calculated the ratio between the deficit of children and young and the surplus of working ages for each SES group. We find that children and young people of the low SES require 2.6 times more resources than the ones generated by the working ages of the same group. This ratio is 1 for the high group. These results highlight that the role of public and private transfer is not the same for all groups. Indeed, in this table we report the part of the life cycle deficit and consumption that is financed with public transfers. Only 13% of the LCD in the first stage and 10% of the consumption. However, there is an important difference between SES groups. Meanwhile, 40% of the LCD of the low CES is supported by public transfers. Medium, high, and high CES are net contributors. These results highlight the important role of other reallocation channels that support children, which we can ascribe to direct use of families' resources. To analyze differences by CES, we present the components of total consumption for the low and high CES groups. The higher the CES, the higher consumption and all its components. Most of CES differences in spending are explained by the gap in the rest of private consumption, that is, non-investment items. But part of the differences come from the gap in human capital investment. To better understand consumption gaps, we observe which are the components that increase their participation when the socioeconomic level increase. The results suggest the presence of a consumption or investment pattern when passing from one CES group to another. Families' reaction to the first step of socioeconomic improvement seems to be a very important rise of consumption per se, with a relative low increases of human capital investment. Further improvements lead to more intense responses in terms of human capital, particularly allocating resources to education. Only when reaching the highest CES group, investment in health gains importance. Expenditure in education and health represent the effort on human capital investment on children made by the society. It takes account for 38% of total consumption of population under age 21. In the case of education, it represents 28%. The per capita age profile responds to differences in educational level cost and in age pattern of school dropout and repetition. Besides, the most noticeable pattern is that at all ages, education increases with CES. Besides, the maximum investment happens at ages 12 to 14 for the low, medium-low, and medium-high CES, but at ages 15 to 17 for the high CES. To explore the sources of CES differences, we consider for each group the attendance rate, the per student spending, that is the public and private education age profile, and the share of private consumption, including fees, material, etc. For children under age 15, given the almost universal coverage, the attendance rate gap between groups is not so important. The differences in per student investment come from the incidence of private expenditure. As this increases, private investment rises while public investment declines. For children at ages 15 to 17, private investment play a role, and there is a strong effect of the differences in dropout. Attendance rate declines for the lowest CES, while it remains stable for the highest CES. CES gap investment in education increases once again at ages 18 to 20. Differences in attendance rate play an important role. On the contrary, the distance in spending per student declines as the result of two opposite forces. On one hand, overage is more intense in low CES, which makes that investment gap widens because high CES attend more expensive levels of education. On the other hand, more than 95% of enrolled persons who are undertaking tertiary education use public services, so the public transfers amount per student does not vary between CES. It is noticeable that the sign of public education gap changes. Per student public investment for low CES more than doubles high CES before age 18, but at ages 18 to 20, high CES public investment more than doubles low CES. Meanwhile, private investment is still much higher for the high than low CES. As a result, the sources of CES differences may respond to different patterns in dropout and per student investment, in particular private investment. Regarding health consumption, it takes account for 10% of per capita consumption of children under age 21. Figures show that health investment increases by SES for all the three age ranges considered. The difference in health expenditure by SES may arise from three factors. One of them is coverage. In our estimation, coverage means to have the entitlement to use a healthcare institution. The Uruguayan healthcare provision is offered by a public healthcare network and private institution. Most of the population is covered through a public program, a public insurance, that funds healthcare provision in public and private institutions. There is also specific healthcare provision to the police and military officers, and those who are not covered by any program may choose private institution and pay the fees or premiums, or may use public healthcare network without charge. As a result of the whole system, the healthcare system seeks to ensure the coverage of all the population, which is successfully achieved. So there is a very low percentage of population that declare not to be entitled. Thus, coverage does not appear as the factor that explains differences in investment by sex. A second cause of the health gaps may be the difference in public transfers. This would come from differences in the incidence of the coverage type within each sex. But the incidence of public provision decreases with sex. Thus, healthcare public transfers do not explain the sex gap. On the contrary, public transfers decreases with sex. Third cause of sex gaps are private expenses that include fees, premiums, copayment, pharmacy spending, etc. These expenses increases by sex. On average, for children under age 21, these expenses of the high sex group are 4 times those of the low sex group, and this gap is similar for all ages. As a result, the main source of sex differences is private expenditure. To finish, we are interested in highlighting some results. The positive relation of human capital investment in children and sex is partially related with coverage. In the case of education, school dropout and repetition are captured in lower amounts of investment. In the case of healthcare, coverage is almost universal and do not play an important role in sex gaps. A major role to explain this gap must be considered to private investment. This is consistent with the role of public transfer mentioned. The medium, high, and high groups generated a surplus of resources that is allocated to the other groups through public channels. The question that remains is whether the quality of public and private human capital investment is the same. We are aware that the gap could underestimate the actual differences if different type of coverage means different quality services. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you very much. I think your study clearly exemplifies how difference in education investments by socioeconomic status, particular private investment, can generate huge disparities in education outcomes, which represents one of the most important mechanisms for the reproduction of socioeconomic inequality in our region. So we finished with the 5 presentations. So let me now invite our first discussant, Mr. Ignacio Apella, for his intervention. Ignacio is a social protection economist at the World Bank. You have the floor, Ignacio.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, thank you, Paulo, for inviting me to be part of this session, in which I know most of the people here, so I am glad to see you again, even if it is virtually. Okay, as many of you know, I am not an NTA guy, but I am a very frequent user of the data produced by all of you, so thank you. Okay, I'm just going to highlight the main results or points presented in the session. As you must have noted, the 5 work are very relevant for the public policy discussion, and they show a lot of results, some of them new, at least for me. So I would like to mention some of them, and in my opinion, the most relevant, and add some specific comment that could be helpful for in future discussion, trying to identify the main challenges the region is facing. Starting by the team presentation, I would like to highlight the estimation of the NTA for the non-rich, what he said, the 90%. I mean, at least to me, it's an innovative approach. I like the methodology. I told him the other day, because in my opinion, well, team confirmed that this methodology, it's easier than estimating the consumption, income, life cycle deficit by socioeconomic status. So if one needs to get some quick result by socioeconomic group, this could be a useful option. About the Casio presentation, the first thing that I have to say is congratulations. I mean, when Paulo called me to invite me to participate in this session, I thought how you associated traditional NTA results with the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, to me, there is not a clear or direct relationship to analyze the consumption and income profile by age with the SDGs. Actually, Casio explicitly mentioned that the objective of the paper is to relate the demographic change with NTA and SDG. So, and you found a friendly way to do it, and I think that it could be a kind of, kickoff for future analysis. Marta's work evidences long hours spent on preparing data from all the included country and on measuring the regional average. So well done, Marta. And then I will get back to the with some specific comment. The case of Uruguay is a particular one given its demographic structure. And I mean, Uruguay is the country in the region in the most advanced stage of its demographic transition, with similar demographic characteristics to those current in the OECD country. This implies that the country has less time to take advantage of the demographic bonus, and therefore is required to increase the investment not only in human capital, but also in physical capital faster than the rest of the region in order to materialize the second dividend. And finally, the Argentinian case, which is similar to the Uruguayan case, and also Marta's work summarized the regional characteristics very well, reinforce the concern, at least my concern, about the possibility that the region has to achieve the second dividend. In this particular case, I mean, in the Argentinian case, Pablo mentioned, the surplus generated by the highest socioeconomic group is absorbed by public sector to finance the life cycle deficit of the other two groups, leaving little room for saving and therefore for physical capital accumulation. So, after hearing the presentations, my impression is that the result presented here confirm the difficulties that the region faces to materialize the second dividend and therefore the SDGs. I say that because in one way or another, the economic growth is a necessary condition to achieve the SDGs. In my opinion, I identify 2 or 3 things that characterize the Latin American economy, which go against reaching of the second dividend. The first one is that the region has a relatively short period of surplus, which is also small, as it was pointed out by Cecilia for the Uruguayan case, Pablo for the Argentinian case, and Marta and Casio for the region. And this is a real challenge, thinking in the long term, because it shows the low saving and investment capacity of the region. The second one is something that Marta pointed out very well, which is beyond the fact that we are transitioning our bonus, we are not taking full advantage of it, given the high level of informality in the labor market, which is a common characteristic in the region. And something important is that informal or formal employment is highly related with the level of productivity of the economy. So one way, or I don't know if it is the only way to increase formal employment is through an increase in productivity, but there is a kind of endogeneity here. So this is a real issue to be considered in order to take advantage of the bonus. So we, as a region, have on average two problems or issues that could be discussed from the policy option perspective. One is that the net transfer to the elderly are relatively higher than those to children. So we are not investing enough in our future human capital endowment. Of course, and I need to be clear here, this fact has a historical connotation due to the development of the pension system in the region, which imply a lot of political economy issues in this dimension. And the other one is the low level of saving the region has, which limits the physical capital accumulation process. So in summary, all the presentations are very important because they confirm preliminary results about the challenges the region faces. For this reason, the region will face serious difficulties to achieve the SDGs, particularly those associated with reduced poverty and inequality. But for example, Marta's work mentioned something that, at least from my point of view, is where we need to focus the effort on, which is to increase resources via increasing the productivity through improving the quality of education and invest in research and development, among others. I mean, the region, as well as the entire world, is experiencing another mega trend, which is the technological change process. So maybe we can take advantage of it, adapting new technologies to increase the total factor productivity and therefore increase the chances to materialize the second dividend and therefore the SDGs. And finally, one important added value of all these works, well, actually of all the NTA LAC project, I think, is estimation of the income and consumption profile and life cycle deficit, etc., by socioeconomic group. The importance of estimation by socioeconomic group is because, for example, as a frequent user of the NTA data to analyze, what are the economic impacts of the aging process, one question that usually comes to my mind is, what is the distributional impact? What is the distributional effect of the aging process? And of course, I had to draft some exercise in the past, but nothing rigorous. So with this new type of information by socioeconomic group, we can see, at least in a first approximation, a very good picture about this dimension. So congratulations, I will stop here. And again, thank you for inviting me. And I really enjoy reading all your works. Thank you.
Thank you, Nacho, for the very important point that you raised in your intervention, highlighting those particularly relevant for the panelists to take into account in their further analysis. Very important. And now I give the floor to our second discussant, Mr. Mauricio Holz, who is a research analyst at the Library of the Chilean National Congress. Go ahead, Mauricio.
Yes, thank you, Paulo. Thank you for the invitation, and Well, I'm very glad to see you all in a good shape. Well, and very interesting presentations. So I have a very brief presentation with some points. So I'm going to share it if someone wants to read it. So I will start. Casio and Marta show us a very particular situations in Latin America in the context of an aging of the population. So the demographic transitions in Latin America is generating a fast pressure on economic support ratio and fiscal support ratio, driven by old age consumption and public benefits, mainly benefits on pensions and health. And this occurs in a context of a persistent inequality, labor market informality, stagnated productivity, and high poverty rates, although with important difference between countries. And also there is a political context, which in my point of view is characterized as an increased political visibility of demands of groups left behind, and an increased demand for changing the model, no? With less market-oriented policies or a more fair access to market-oriented policy. This is particularly the case right now in Chile. So of course I mentioned it, but maybe it's not the case in other countries. But now in Chile we are seeing this very this political context, this social, a very diverse political context. So and also there's countries are in a different stage of the demographic transition. Some countries still have years or decades to take advantage of the demographic dividend, but in many countries the demographic dividend is gone, the first demographic dividend. But still in countries in an advanced stage of the demographic transition, there will be an increase of children and youth economic support ratio. So one sound policy that one could imagine is to reinvest the resources liberated by the decline in youth and in children and youth population into the education system. So because this might increase productivity and in the long run might increase also the surplus at working ages, creating resources to transfers to old people, old population. But as Casio mentioned, and as the paper of Casio described it very well, there might be two reasons to be pessimistic about this approach. One is that the demographic dividend in Latin America has not been accompanied with major increases in productivity. And also there is an increased political pressure for policies like universal income scheme, non-contributory pension scheme, and unemployment benefit, which will rival in a post-COVID-19 scenario with long-run objectives. No? So COVID, the currently scenario is not helping much with long-run objectives. And also, as Marisa and Cecilia showed, there's a lot of inequality in our education system. So a high proportion of low socioeconomic children and youth consumption is financed by private transfers, compared with by public transfers, compared with high-cess children and youth, which finance their consumption mostly with private transfers. The same occurs for consumption on education. Low SES children finance their education consumption with public transfers, and high SES children finance their consumption with private transfers. And also private education consumption in high SES children are like 2 or 3 times higher than public education consumption in children. So the difference in resources allocated to low SES children versus high SES children is very high, you know. And also there is a particularity in tertiary education where public transfers mainly flow to higher SES youth because they have more access to tertiary education. So why this might be important for the demographic dividend? I think, in my opinion, that this is important because the reduction in the youth dependency ratio in high SES group mainly liberate private resources, which in my opinion are more difficult to allocate to public goods, like general productivity. And if it's the case that are reinvested in education and could increase productivity, these private resources will maintain the levels of inequality of the society and of the education system. And also there's an inequality that Cecilia and Marisa put in their paper, that, well, there is a difference in the amount of resources allocated to education in low SES groups and in high SES group, but there might be but this could be subestimating the effect because of difference in quality of education between public education and private education. Also, this is an open question. And also, the less access low socioeconomic groups have to tertiary education also creates an inequality, because tertiary education is improve the productivity of people in the knowledge society. So I would like to finish with some points about Tim's paper. Well, I think first I think that combined distributional national income accounts and national transfers account, it's an improvement in order to capture transfers by age and SES and the relationships between them. Well, DINA seems to be a more precise source of information to capture asset income of the 10% and the 1% wealthiest people. And as preliminary estimations show, rich middle-aged persons finance an important proportion of the life cycle deficit of non-rich old dependents through the state, mainly through the pension system, and also save to finance their own consumption when old through capital income. So I don't know, there's a kind of equilibrium in which the wealthiest people transfer resources to finance old people through the state, but also save to finance their consumption then with capital income. So they use capital market, and the other 90% use the state to finance their own consumption. So this raises a question for whom capital market works in order to finance consumption at old ages and for whom not. So I'm going to finish with this. So the Chilean pension system is the case, no? So in Chile exists a massive pension system based on capital market with a non-contributory pillar that guarantee a minimum pension. So of the 1.8 million beneficiaries, currently beneficiaries of the pension system, near 50% apply for the non-contributory pillar. And the overall replacement rate of the system is 37.3%, which is the lowest or one of the lowest of the OECD. So that gives an answer of gives us an answer of for whom the capital market works and for whom not. It's not working for most of the beneficiaries in Chile, and is working for a few. So just to finish, after 40 years of the implementation of this system, is now under discussion a new equilibrium that includes the introduction of a solidarity contribution pension pillar and a high rate of contribution that goes from the currently 12% of labor income to 16% of the labor income. So that's all, Paulo. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. Again, a very important points you raised that will certainly contribute to improve the further analysis of the panelists. Thank you. I see that the time of the session is over, but I was allowed by the organizers to use a few extra time for debate. So I open the floor to those who want to make some comments or have questions regarding the presentations. I'm going to take a couple of interventions. Tim Miller is asking for the floor.
Yeah, hey, thanks. So one question I had for everyone is that a lot of people pointed out or seem to be very pessimistic about the future. And I wanted to see if the participants could give me something hopeful to hang on to.
Wow, it's a very hard question, Tim, in the context we are living now. But it's a good question. I don't know if somebody could give Tim a nice answer. Well, we know we are from the United Nations, and the mantra now in the United Nations is, instead of going back to the normal, is building better, building back better. So this is the way we can be optimistic about the future, that people are gonna maybe open the eyes and see that this kind of socioeconomic situation, or this kind of a model, socioeconomic model that we are living, is not sustainable. So I would say that this is the optimistic way to see. Although we are 5 months now into the crisis, and still I can see that people, the right people that should be awake, are doing this. But anyway.
Great, thanks. I really like that answer.
So I think we are late already. I see no other people asking for the floor. Just would like to thank the panelists for the excellent presentation. Also, I'd like to thank the discussants for their very relevant and pertinent comments, and of course for accepting my invitation, and for all colleagues that joined the session and participating to debate. Well, I take the opportunity to invite you all to stay connected for the second part of the session that I understand will start in a few minutes. Thank you all again, and bye-bye.